1978. Argentina won the Football World Cup, and in Britain, the first test tube baby was born. The Bee Gees' Staying Alive was the disco anthem of the year. In the world of cars, two limited production specials grabbed the attention: the BMW M1 and the Renault 5 Turbo. In Formula 1, Niki Lauda was world champion, having made an amazing comeback after his accident in 1976. His season at Ferrari had been successful, but his relationship with the team was poor, and he joined Brabham for 1978. His place at Ferrari had been taken by a new young driver called Villeneuve. Ferrari was champion constructor, but in design terms, Lotus was the team to watch. The Argentinian Grand Prix, and for the first time in 4 years, Niki Lauda was not in a Ferrari. The reigning champion was a Brabham driver now. Mario Andretti, on the other hand, had stayed with Colin Chapman and Lotus. Alongside Andretti and Peterson, back from Tyrrell, Hector Rebaque of Mexico drove a third Lotus, but failed to qualify. Another non-qualifier attracted more attention than Rebaque. Davina Galizia was a successful skier who turned to car racing and achieved some success in Britain. She found Formula 1 more difficult, however, and had failed to qualify in the 2 non-championship races she'd entered. This was her third attempt, and an outdated Hesketh was not the best car with which to try. Clay Regazzoni had moved from Ensign to Shadow and could hope for better results. Alan Jones had left Shadow to join Frank Williams' new team. Jean-Pierre Jarier was in the ATS team again, alongside new recruit Jochen Maas. America's Brett Lunger was to drive a McLaren M23 this year, while Jody Scheckter was again in the single Wolf entry. Wolf's formula for success was one car with a top-class driver, backed by top-class personnel like designer Harvey Postlethwaite and team manager Peter Waugh. Tyrrell had ditched its six-wheeler and had a new designer, Maurice Philippe, and a new car, the 008. James Hunt was a fixture in the McLaren team now, but he had a new teammate in Francis Patrick Tambay. John Watson remained at Brabham, hoping to fulfill the promise the car had shown last year, and Gilles Villeneuve was starting his first full season with Ferrari. As Mass pulled into place, the first Grand Prix of 1978 was ready to start. It turned out to be a triumph for Mario Andretti. He qualified on pole and led the race from start to finish, the JPS Lotus 78 wing car once again showing it was the class of the field. Niki Lauda was second, a good start with his new team, and Patrick Depailler was third, an encouraging result for the new Tyrrell. The venue for the Brazilian Grand Prix was a new circuit near Rio, but although the circuit was new, the weather was the same, extremely hot. Hunt and Tambay both used water-cooled bodysuits, but they did little good and all the drivers found the circuit extremely tiring. The race would surely be a test of human stamina as much as mechanical reliability. Davina Galizia's lack of physical strength was an even greater disadvantage here, and once again she failed to qualify. Tyres were a major talking point this season. Ferrari had taken the major step of changing their suppliers from Goodyear to Michelin, who had entered Grand Prix racing with Renault the previous year. The American firm no longer had a monopoly. Arrows was a new name on the grid, the car driven by Patrese. The team was made up mainly of ex-Shadow employees, and the design was very similar to the latest Shadow. The legal battles over this would rumble on for some time. James Hunt's success and personality had made him a celebrity in Britain. He was at home then in the company of visiting rock stars like Rod Stewart. As the grid formed up, the drivers needed shade from the merciless sun of the Brazilian afternoon. With James Hunt busy in his office, Rod Stewart strolled through the grid with Bernie Ecclestone. When the lights went out to start the race, it became clear that Ferrari had done the right thing by going to Michelin. Carlos Reutemann shot through from his position on the second row of the grid to take a lead he was never to relinquish. Lauda, 10th on the grid, worked his way up to 3rd, but the big surprise was former champion Emerson Fittipaldi, who gained his best result so far for Copersucar by finishing 2nd. In the days before Grand Prix circuits were giant, luxuriously equipped TV studios, the infield at Kyalami had the friendly atmosphere of a caravan park. The temporary residents, like Gilles Villeneuve and Walter Wolf, would pass the time of day with their neighbours. Sometimes residents would think about inviting the neighbours in for a cup of something. The atmosphere at the South African Grand Prix was somehow more relaxed. James Hunt was rarely tense, but at Kyalami he was always more sociable, with time to chat to his fellow drivers. Although the conversation with Ronnie Peterson looked serious.
In two occasions I was following you and you were following another car. And then somehow...
Ferrari was giving a new car, the T3, its first outing. It was a development of the 312 T2 with which Lauda had won the championship. Brabham also had new cars for Lauda and Watson. Like the Ferrari, it was an upgrade of the 1977 car. Ferrari and Brabham Alpha had a disadvantage when it came to following the wing car principles of the Lotus 78. Their flat 12 engines were too wide to get the full aerodynamic advantages of the wide side panels Lotus used to such good effect. Other Cosworth-powered teams were urgently looking at wing car designs, but as yet only Arrows and Shadow had them on the track. For Copersucar and other teams, they were still on the drawing board. Kyalami saw the return of Renault and its 1.5-litre turbocharged engine. Driven by Jean-Pierre Jabouille, the compact French car had pioneered the Michelin radial tyres that had proved so efficient for Ferrari in Brazil. When practice was over, Andretti and Lauda were on the front row of the grid, ahead of Hunt and Tambay in their McLarens. At the start, Andretti took the lead, but Scheckter squeezed his way through from the third row to take second ahead of Lauda and Hunt. The reaction of the South African crowd to Scheckter's excellent start must have made their makeshift stands even more dangerous. The leading quartet was now being tailed by a newcomer, Riccardo Patrese in the Arrows. The young Italian was making astounding progress, and after 26 laps he took over the lead from Scheckter, who'd passed Andretti. Behind him, Depailler was ahead of Lauda, while Andretti and Scheckter had both lost places. Patrese led for almost 40 of the 78 laps before he had to drop out with engine trouble. Depailler then looked like winning, but 3 laps from home his engine started to miss. Andretti almost ran out of fuel, and the surprise winner was Ronnie Peterson, who'd climbed steadily through the field from 11th on the grid. Depailler hung on to take second, while John Watson was third. A 4th place for Alan Jones in the Williams was an encouraging result for the new team. To California and Long Beach for the US Grand Prix West, the last race before the European season started. It was early in the season, but Jody Scheckter still had no championship points. Mario Andretti was leading, but only by 1 point. It was still wide open. Safety clothing was now very efficient. A number of companies, many of them here in the USA, were constantly working on improving the fire-resistant qualities of shoes, suits, underwear, gloves and helmets. Layer upon layer of clothing was the key to safety. Fortunately, this was not the case with one of the great personalities of American racing, Miss Hurst Golden Shifter, Linda Vaughn. This really was racing in the streets, and as the grid formed up on the corner of Linden Avenue, Carlos Reutemann was on pole with Gilles Villeneuve beside him. The Michelins were obviously working well here. Next up were Lauda and Andretti, and they were followed by Watson and Peterson. 3 teams, Ferrari, Brabham and JPS Lotus, monopolised the front of the grid, and there was less than a second between the times of Reutemann and Peterson. Despite the efforts of Lauda, Villeneuve made the best start and led the first half of the race before sliding off. He may have been the victim of inexperience or youthful enthusiasm, but there was no doubting his talent. The more controlled Reutemann had been following the young Canadian, and he took over the lead for the latter half of the race, earning his second win of the season. After a sensible drive that spared his tyres, Andretti was runner-up, while Depailler was third, giving the Tyrrell 008 another podium finish. Reutemann's smile as he took the lap of honour reflected the fact that the 9 points he'd scored put him joint first in the championship table beside Mario Andretti. Next up were Depailler and Peterson, with 14 points to the leaders' 18. There could be no greater contrast to the streets of Long Beach than the streets of Monaco. In 1978, the drivers were able to make a direct comparison as the 2 races followed each other in the calendar. Patrick Depailler must have been looking forward to racing on what was effectively French soil. Riccardo Patrese and Britain's Rupert Keegan were relative newcomers to Formula 1 here, but Emerson Fittipaldi was an old hand, as was Jackie Ickx, returning at the wheel of an Ensign. Vittorio Brambilla was unhappy in the Surtees and failed to qualify, but he was in good company. Despite efforts that left their mark on their faces, neither did Jarier nor Mas. The exertion showed on Villeneuve's fresh face too, after he qualified 8th. Experience, Ferrari power and Michelin tyres paid off for teammate Reutemann, however. He finished practice on pole. Tyrrell's link with French oil company Elf meant that there was always a French driver in the team. This year there were 2. Newman Didier Pironi had won the Formula 3 race here the previous year. Pironi had youth, Regazzoni and Andretti had years of experience between them. Recruiting Ronnie Peterson to join Mario gave Colin Chapman one of the strongest teams on pit road. Ligier, like Wolff and Renault, concentrated all its efforts on one driver. Jacques Lafitte was repaying the special attention he received with good results, and the car was constantly improving. In practice, Wolff tried a new car, the WR5, but decided that for the race, Scheckter would rely on the trusty WR1. If the Renault, its exhaust muffled by the turbocharger, brought a new sound to Grand Prix racing, the howl of the Alpha 12 cylinder in the Brabham brought pleasure to the traditionalists. Watson would put his next to Reutemann on the front row of the grid, and Lauda would be third. The arrival of Princess Grace and Prince Rainier was the final element in the countdown to the Grand Prix. Now the grid could form up behind Reutemann's Ferrari. While Watson and mechanic Herbie Blash cleared the people out of the way to check the line of sight into the first corner, Niki Lauda was having a word with designer Gordon Murray. A last thought about tactics for Mario Andretti, and then the field sets off on the sighting lap before being unleashed through the Sainte Devote corner and up the hill towards the casino. With the marshals waving a warning, the cars howled up the hill. Watson's Brabham led, but there was no sign of Reutemann. He'd tangled with Lauda on the entry to Sainte Devote and dropped to last place. As the rest of the field attacked the twists and turns from the top of Monte Carlo back down to the waterfront, the Ferrari team leader was heading for the pits and new rear tyres. He rejoined the race, but his chances of victory were now zero. He could only join the rest in their pursuit of Watson. Hunt was on his way to retirement. He'd got caught up behind Reutemann and Lauda's little argument and hit the barriers. At the head of the race, Watson and Depailler were fighting it out. They were chased by Lauda, who'd opened up a gap of a few lengths over Andretti, Scheckter, Peterson and Villeneuve. Ken Tyrrell had the watch on his man Depailler, who was matching Watson's every move as the pair opened up a gap to the pack. Then, with half the race run, the Frenchman got past the Brabham. Although the Tyrrell crew was concentrating on the leader, it didn't stop them appreciating the way in which, with just 2 laps to go, Lauda passed Scheckter to take second place. Lauda was no threat to Depailler, who had a 20-second cushion protecting him. Nevertheless, the Austrian, who had made a pit stop for tyres, was certainly driving like a world champion. But Depailler was safe, and the checkered flag signalled his first Grand Prix victory. It was a great reward for a driver who'd competed in 68 Grand Prix, all for Tyrrell, and had come second no less than 8 times. The fact that his win put him in the lead for the championship just made his rendezvous with the Prince and Princess even more memorable. The big topic of conversation at Zolder for the Belgian Grand Prix was Goodyear's reaction to the threat posed by Michelin. The French company was supplying just 3 cars, while Goodyear had to provide for the other 20 or more. In future, the American giant had announced here, it would provide a full choice of tyres to just 8 drivers: Andretti, Depailler, Fittipaldi, Hunt, Lauda, Peterson, Scheckter and Watson, plus the 2 fastest qualifiers. The rest would have to make do with standard production tyres. It wasn't a popular decision. Those who had to use standard tyres described them as being made of wood. But it was the only way to fight against a company putting all its effort into just 2 teams. At least Goodyear had the team that was technically ahead of the others. Zolder saw the introduction of an improved Lotus 78 wing car, the 79. And right out of the box, Andretti put it on pole. The wing car concept used the shape of the car as a whole, together with sliding side skirts to improve road holding. Colin Chapman explained the principles behind his new design.
Well, for years, of course, we've all been concerned with the effect that air has when it flows over the car, and we've been trying to do our best to stop it flow under the car. What we're really trying to do is to promote airflow under the car in order to be able to contour the underside of the car so it produces a negative lift. In other words, the air passing under the car helps to hold it on the road. Holds the car down, it improves the grip of the tyres on the road, improves the stability of the car, and improves the safety of the car.
Wolf's WR5 was also new. It was not as radical as the Lotus, but it did have its oil cooler in an unusual position below the windscreen, and the wing supports were U-shaped as in the Renault. On the driver front, Bruno Giacomelli, who had raced for McLaren in Italy last year, was back with the team again. At the start, Andretti maintained his pole position advantage and took a lead he was never to lose. Gilles Villeneuve leapt ahead of his Ferrari teammate and was the only driver to keep in touch with the new Lotus. His challenge failed on lap 40, however, when one of his front tyres failed completely. He made it back to the pit for a replacement, but he was too far back to be a threat to Andretti, who was in complete command. Peterson also had to pit for new tyres, but he fought back to finish second ahead of Reutemann and Villeneuve, setting a new lap record as he went. Colin Chapman was understandably ecstatic as he greeted his two drivers. The wing car had arrived, and it was to change the face of Grand Prix racing. To make the day complete, Andretti's win had put him in the lead for the championship. The Spanish Grand Prix at Jarama near Madrid was another display of the superiority of the new Lotus. James Hunt led for the first 5 laps, but he and the McLaren were not showing the quality they had in previous seasons, and the British driver finally finished 6th. Andretti took over the lead from Hunt, while Peterson, who'd slipped from 2nd on the grid to 9th at the end of the first lap, made a spectacular climb through the field and finished 2nd. Colin Chapman's hat went into orbit once again, and the Lotus pair got to meet the King of Spain on the podium. Alongside them was Jacques Lafitte, showing Goodyear that he deserved a place among their favoured runners. The American tyre company was on top here, as both Ferraris suffered problems with their Michelins. For the Swedish Grand Prix at Anderstorp, the Brabham team had prepared something very special. It had the whole of pit lane looking and talking, with designers, team managers, drivers and journalists inspecting the new BT46 and wondering what lay behind the dustbin lid that covered its tail. Colin Chapman and Ken Tyrrell were in conversation with Brabham chief mechanic Herbie Blash and designer Gordon Murray, while Niki Lauda was being quizzed by the press. Gerard Larousse and Gérard Ducarouge of Renault were talking to Bernie Eccleston. Jacques Lafitte was pumping veteran mechanic Ermanno Cuoghi, but nobody was giving anything away. The official line was that the outlet at the rear was simply an oversized fan to cool the Brabham's Alfa Romeo Flat 12 engine. But why, the designers and engineers from other teams were asking, did the car require skirts that reached the ground like those of a hovercraft? Why did it need an aircraft-type pressure-sensing probe on the nose? Everyone knew that Gordon Murray was an inventive designer. What had he invented this time? Experienced drivers like Depailler and new boys like Rosberg were all searching for information, but the Brabham mechanics just busied themselves with polishing the beast. To Jabouille, used to the tiny Renault power unit, the back end of the Brabham must have looked enormous. Clay Regazzoni had seen nothing like it in 108 Grand Prix. Everything became clear when Niki Lauda pulled on his King Rat helmet and took the car out to practice. The Brabham was nothing but a giant vacuum cleaner using suction from the fan to pull it down onto the track. The Lotus crew had seen nothing like it, but it worked. Andretti was on pole, but 2nd and 3rd were Watson and Lauda, and at the start Lauda shot through to challenge Andretti. The fan car was a little slower than the Lotus on the straights, but it made up time in the corners where its grip was something else. With half the race run, Lauda held a solid 2nd place to Andretti. The American was lucky to be ahead. Drivers that followed the fan cars found they left a trail of dust that they'd cleaned from the track behind them. The other teams could hardly believe what they were seeing. Watson went out with a jammed throttle, caused by dust vacuumed into the engine, but Lauda clung to Andretti until, on lap 39, the American made the slightest of errors in a gear change. The Austrian seized the opportunity and took the lead. Andretti's engine failed with 24 laps to go, and Patrese took over 2nd spot ahead of Peterson. This was Alfa Romeo's first Grand Prix win since the 1950s, but the political fallout was enormous. Other teams weren't happy, and neither was the international governing body of the sport. This win was allowed to stand, but fan cars were banned immediately afterwards. To the Paul Ricard circuit for the French Grand Prix, pit buildings that were 15 to 20 years ahead of their time. Brabham had seen the future and it didn't work, so Lauda was back in a conventional car. Without a fan, he was still 3rd on the grid.
The 2
Tambe was settling in at McLaren and Hunt was qualifying well. He was fourth fastest here, but not getting the results. Peterson was fifth on the grid, but Villeneuve was ninth. This was a Goodyear track. Scheckter qualified seventh, while Patrese was 12th. Jones was in the row behind him, 14th. Fittipaldi was back on the 8th row, while Mass was right at the back on row 13. The first three on the grid were Lauda, Andretti and Watson, who took pole by just 0.05 of a second from the Lotus driver. Watson led into the first corner, but by the end of the first lap, Andretti was ahead. This circuit, with its long, straight and fast corners, suited the wing car format, and after 10 laps, Peterson had moved up into second place behind Mario. Best of the rest was James Hunt, who managed to hang on to the two Lotuses and to stick with them throughout the race, a constant threat to Peterson. After Hunt had passed Watson to take third place on lap 15, the race positions didn't change for 40 laps. Behind the two JPS cars and Hunt came Watson, Jones, Scheckter and Lafitte. It may have been a procession, but it was a fast and exciting procession, particularly for the first three. Andretti's win extended his lead in the championship, and second place Peterson stretched his lead over Lauda to 11 points. In the Constructors' Championship, Lotus were totally dominant, with 58 points to Ferrari's 22. The Italian cars were outclassed here. Reutemann finished last, despite setting fastest lap of the race. "15 minutes before the British Grand Prix at Brands Hatch, and the grid is packed with people. Among them was McLaren's Italian driver Bruno Giacomelli, although his car bore the team mechanic's Irish version of his name. All around, there were last-minute discussions. Ingegnere Forghieri was talking to Villeneuve, John Watson was talking to friends, and Carlos Reutemann was talking to the Duke of Kent. The Duke was guest of honour at the race, and meeting the drivers was one of the perks that goes with the position. By the time he met Reutemann, 8th on the grid, the Duke would have already met Niki Lauda, who was 3rd. When it came to motor racing royalty at Brands Hatch, Mario Andretti was king of the hill and Ronnie Peterson was his crown prince. The Lotus 79 was currently the best car in Formula 1, and the two made up the front row of the grid, Mario ahead. The two JPS cars led the way leaving the grid, and as the field went through the awe-inspiring paddock bend, Peterson held off a challenge from Scheckter that threatened his team leader. The result was that as the cars came down the hill from Druids Bend with less than a third of a lap completed, Andretti and Peterson already had a handy lead. Less fortunate was Hans Stuck in the shadow. Luckily, his trip across the grass left the car undamaged, and he went from next to last on the first lap to 5th at the finish. Peterson didn't get off so lightly. His car lasted only 7 laps before retiring with fuel pump failure. Andretti dropped out too, just before 1/3 distance, leaving Scheckter in the lead from Lauda. But the South African's hold on first place loosened when he headed to the pits with a gearbox problem. This left Lauda first and Reutemann second, the Argentinian all over the Brabham's gearbox. Then, as Lauda came up to lap Giacomelli, he was balked and Reutemann was through. He was the 4th and final driver to lead a race that had been one of the best of the season. Elole accepted the applause of the crowd and made his way to the podium. But The excitement wasn't over yet. Watch the Royal Automobile Club official and the man from Moët and Chandon preparing the champagne on the left of the picture. The start of the German Grand Prix at Hockenheim. Watch the back of the grid at the left. Confusion over the starting lights made Depailler hit the back of Tambay's McLaren. It was to be a short race for the Tyrrell driver. Once again, the front row of the grid was all Lotus, and Mario Andretti led from the lights. Peterson followed him, but was to drop out with less than 10 laps to go. Star of the day was Jody Scheckter. As the cars came past the pits on the second lap, he was last. By lap 37, he was second and making his way through the back markers, many of whom he had already passed during a superb drive through the field. He held on to second until the flag, finishing 15 seconds behind Andretti and 12 ahead of Jacques Lafitte, who was third. Alan Jones was unlucky. He held a solid third behind the two Lotuses for almost two-thirds of the race, before fuel vaporization problems forced him into retirement. Like others in this race of attrition, 13 of the 24 starters retired, Jones was a victim of the hot weather. Another win, another 9 points. Mario Andretti was looking more and more the potential champion, particularly since Peterson hadn't scored. After the massive artificial stadium of Hockenheim, the next round of the championship was in the rolling green countryside of Austria. In a quiet moment ahead of practice, Teddy Mayer of McLaren took the opportunity to look over the car that sooner or later his team would have to match, the Lotus 79. Ronnie Peterson couldn't resist strolling over to let Teddy know just how good it was. Alistair Caldwell was another McLaren man checking out the 79. But Ronnie was the one that got to drive it. Like all Grand Prix cars of the time, the Lotus was a snug fit for the driver. Making yourself comfortable in the cockpit was a job that needed outside assistance. All Grand Prix drivers need their hands to explain how their car is behaving. Patrick Tambay could do it with just one. Sitting quietly in the car waiting to go out, Mario Andretti would be thinking through the task in hand. An experienced and analytical driver, he provided exceptional feedback to his engineers. Jody Scheckter, Ronnie Peterson and Mario Andretti all sheltered from the Austrian rain under personalised umbrellas. If Patrick Depailler wanted one, he'd have to change his name to Elf Tyrrell City Corp. Sponsors' umbrellas were commonplace, but pens on a string were new and confusing technology. Jochen Mass had a Goodyear umbrella, while Reutemann's looked as though it had been stolen from a petrol station forecourt. When it cleared up, Patrick Tambay was in a good mood about going out to work. And so it seemed were all the other drivers, judging by the way they streamed out of the congested Österreichring pit lane and accelerated away up the hill. When practice was over, it was the usual story, with two Lotuses on the front row of the grid. This time, however, it was Peterson on pole by just 0.05 of a second. A surprising third was Jabouille in the Renault. The French car was getting better and better. Now it just needed reliability. The rain returned in earnest for race day, and until grid time arrived, cars and crews huddled under the little shelter the pit awnings provided. It looked as though the rain would stop, and everyone started on slick tyres. Andretti was the first to regret the decision. He went off on the first lap. Peterson was masterful on dry tyres, matching engine power to grip and achieving the perfect balance. But everyone was driving on tippy toes. Listen to the engine notes to see how carefully they're taking it. After 7 laps, when the rain became even heavier, the decision was taken to stop the race. Despite the fact that the sun was breaking through for the restart, everyone started on wet tyres. Peterson took an immediate lead, but after 11 laps, he came in for slicks. He came out of the pits 5th, and within 10 laps, he was in first place once more, holding a commanding lead over first Villeneuve and then Dupaillet. The Frenchman passed the young Ferrari driver after 21 laps of the 47-lap second leg of the race. It had been a chaotic event in many respects, but in the end, the sun shone on Peterson's second win for Lotus in the Austrian Grand Prix. This result closed the gap between Peterson and Andretti in the championship, but there were team orders in force, and the American held the advantage. From a historical point of view, this race was important because it was Gilles Villeneuve's first podium finish. The sand dunes of Zandvoort were crowded. It was Dutch Grand Prix time again. McLaren had what was effectively a B team of young drivers, and Bruno Giacomelli was one of them. What nobody knew at the time was that Ronnie Peterson was talking to McLaren about a place in the A team. Clay Regazzoni was also talking contracts with Williams. Niki Lauda had no need to talk to other teams. Brabham wanted to keep him, and he was happy there. Regazzoni needed a change. The shadow team was not what it was, and he failed to qualify here. Mario Andretti was another driver who had no need to leave a team where he was safe in the number 1 slot. Peterson, whose contract emphasized Mario's supremacy, was tired of obeying team orders, but he did. The Brabham was undoubtedly beautiful, but it wasn't a wing car. Ferrari hadn't yet embraced the new technology either. The Lotus 79 represented the new wave, with wide sponsons beside the cockpit that housed the features that gave the wing car its name. The slopes beside the cockpit showed that the McLaren was also from the last generation. For the moment, Lotus had an advantage, and its drivers were exploiting it to the maximum. Once again, they formed the front row of the grid, Andretti first and Peterson just 0.3 of a second slower. Behind them came Lauda and Reutemann. The sun was bright as the cars lined up on the grid. Behind Lauda on the third row was Gilles Villeneuve, improving but still impetuous. At the back of the grid was another youngster, Nelson Piquet, in his third Grand Prix. As the grid formed up behind Andretti, it was almost a case of wondering who would be first in the non-Lotus class. And as the cars catapulted towards the Tarzan corner, Andretti and Peterson did nothing to change that opinion. As the field set off into the dunes at the back of the circuit, it was Lafitte who led the chase after a scintillating start from the third row. The end of the first lap, and the two Lotuses are already beginning to open up a gap to the rest as they speed along the start and finish straight. Once again, it's Andretti in the lead and a dutiful Peterson in second place. At the end of the straight is the notorious Tarzan bend, a full semicircle that Andretti in the 79 handled with complete mastery. After 5 laps or so, the pattern of the race is being formed. Following Andretti and Peterson, the pack is led by Lauda, Reutemann and Watson. Then come Fittipaldi, Villeneuve, Lafitte and Jones. Then there's a gap to Hunt, Depailler, Tambay, Jabouille, Stuck, Scheckter, Rybak and Rosberg, Piquet, Giacomelli and Brambilla. Ahead of them all, however, from lights to flag, was once again Mario Andretti, with Ronnie Peterson right behind him. As he crossed the line, Andretti almost lapped Lafitte, who finished 8th for the second time. As the Lotus pair climbed onto the podium and collected their trophies and garlands, it was another demonstration of how far ahead the JPS Lotus 79 was. No wonder Niki Lauda looked glum. He finished some 12 seconds behind Andretti and Peterson, who were such a double act that they crossed the line just 0.03 of a second apart. But that closeness was making Peterson discontented. He was sure he could beat his teammate, but his contract and his sense of fair play prevented him. The prospect of being team leader at McLaren was very attractive. Following Andretti in a championship race and waiting for him to break down was not the ideal situation. September, and the traditional date for the Italian Grand Prix at Monza. This is one of the great races on the Formula 1 calendar, full of history and with an enthusiastic crowd, almost all of whom have come to worship Ferrari. But this car and this man looked set to spoil the crowd's weekend. The Lotus 79, Mario Andretti and Ronnie Peterson had dominated the season and looked good for a win here too. Other drivers and teams, like Patrick Tambay and McLaren, had not given up hope. However, the McLaren M26 and most of the cars lined up in front of the pits were now outdated. The teams were counting on their designers to play catch-up in order to challenge JPS Lotus and its mould-breaking wing cars. Clay Regazzoni was one of the few drivers who had a former wing car, but his shadow team had lost the car's designer and had been embroiled in legal arguments for much of the year. There was no way it could challenge Lotus. As for Colin Chapman and his drivers, they had every reason to play the jokers in the pack. Emerson Fittipaldi's Coppice car was improving steadily, but the arrival of the Lotus had raised the bar. Brabham had attempted to catch up with the fan car, but the establishment's response had been merely nice try. McLaren had more on their plate than an outdated car. James Hunt had lost impetus this year, and his contract would not be renewed for 1979. His replacement would be Ronnie Peterson, possibly paired with a young driver like Brazil's Nelson Piquet or Italy's Bruno Giacomelli. For Mario Andretti, preparing to go out for practice, the most important consideration was the world title. A win here and in the next race in America would guarantee the championship, even if Peterson finished his usual second in both races. Retirement in any of the remaining 3 events could see the title going down to the wire in Canada. The permutations must have been tumbling through his mind. Patrick Tambay now knew that his teammate at McLaren next year would be Ronnie Peterson. The news had been announced a week ago. The Frenchman might have hoped that he would be promoted when Hunt, who was rumoured to be going to Wolf, left, but as a realist, he knew Peterson would have to be number 1. Many people were of the opinion that Ronnie was only finishing second in the Lotus because of team orders, and he was a natural leader for any team he joined, ready to challenge the top drivers at Ferrari, Brabham, and yes, Lotus. For Ronnie, the move to McLaren would be a challenge, and one that he would relish. But now was the time to stop thinking about the future and concentrate on the job in hand, practice. Brett Lunger's McLaren led the cars out of the pits, followed by Brambilla, G-Max, an Italian privateer who failed to qualify, Piquet, Patrese, Rabac, Giacomelli, Fittipaldi, Jones, Scheckter, Villeneuve, Daly, Blake-Molen, Hunt, Tambay, Andretti, Lafitte and Pironi. Niki Lauda was fourth on the grid, and between him and Andretti on pole were two newcomers to the front two rows. Villeneuve had set second fastest time, and in third place was Jabouille in the Renault. The Canadian had captured the imagination of the fans by qualifying no less than 9 places ahead of Reutemann. As the mechanics topped up his fuel tank, it was allowed in 1978, the crowd must have been thinking that maybe he could challenge the all-conquering Lotus and Andretti. Jones was 6th fastest and alongside Peterson on the 3rd row. Watson was 8th, on the 4th row alongside Scheckter. Reutemann languished back on row 6, and behind him was Fittipaldi. As the field rolled round from the sighting lap, it seemed that the front row had hardly stopped before the starting signal was given. The premature start and a dash by Patrese down the pit side of the track were two of the reasons given for the multiple collision that occurred on the run into the first chicane. Hunt spun, and the ensuing crash involved 5 other cars, including that of Peterson, who went head-on into the barriers. His car burst into flames, and Hunt bravely went into the fire to drag Ronnie out, his legs badly injured. The race was stopped and medical personnel started to work on the Swede as all around shocked drivers and track personnel tried to come to terms with what had happened. There was little they could do to help one of their most valued colleagues. That was a job for experts. Some stood in dismay and bewilderment. Some looked for a way to help. For the drivers who'd been involved, the best thing to do was to make their way back to the pits and their teams. A shocked Mario Andretti, who'd been ahead of the accident and was stopped with the rest of the front runners as they completed their first lap, was heading back to the pits when he saw a doctor. He urged him to go to his teammates' help. Niki Lauda was also among the leading group that had come round to see the scene of carnage ahead of them. He was surrounded by press as he returned to his car in the pits. Eventually, Peterson was taken to hospital, where his injuries were judged to be serious but not life-threatening. Preparations were made to restart the race. But it wasn't really a race. Nobody had the heart for it, and it ended as a fiasco. But worse was to come. That night, Ronnie Peterson died. Not from his injuries, but on the operating table of a Milan hospital. The show went on, but Formula 1 went into mourning. With Ronnie Peterson dead, no one else could beat Mario Andretti's points total, so he was world champion, and as such was the focus of every camera on the grid for the US Grand Prix at Watkins Glen. This wasn't the way it was meant to be, however. Mario had built up a good relationship with Ronnie during their time as teammates, and his death hit him hard. He wasn't alone. The loss of a true driver's driver, who always gave of his best and was always good to watch, was felt by fellow competitors and fans alike. There was hope that Mario, starting from pole and leading from the start, might be the first American to win the Watkins Glen Grand Prix. But after 3 laps his brakes began to fail and then his engine died. Carlos Reutemann took the lead and held it to the flag. With Reutemann first, Jones second and Scheckter third, the record crowd that had showed up for the race was even denied the chance to salute their champion on the podium. For Andretti, this was an anticlimax to what should have been a fantastic season, and it was made worse at the Canadian Grand Prix, in which Andretti qualified 9th and finished 10th, as Villeneuve scored his first Grand Prix win on his home circuit. With first place for Mario Andretti and second for Ronnie Peterson, Lotus could look back on a season worthy of true champions. In third place, with 4 wins and consistent finishes, was the quiet Argentinian Carlos Reutemann. But with no less than 6 victories, Mario Andretti, only the second American to win the World Championship, was the driver of the year.